Hello dear learner, I welcome you to the lecture 5 of week 11. And as we know that we have been talking about the critique of the theory and practice of caste in our last 4 lectures, and in this lecture also we will make some more understanding of the critique of the theory and practice of caste from the perspective of Ayodhya Periyar, and then the contribution of the Dalit Panther and Kasiram and his BSP. And we will also see another very important aspect of the Dalit narrative of the critique of modernity. So, with this overview of the concepts which will be covered in today's lecture, now let me start with some of the important anti-caste movements which occurred in the South. Now, because of the paucity of time and space, it is not possible to discuss all the thinkers and movements in this one lecture, but yes, we have tried to analyze some of the prominent thinkers and the movements which have been started by them. In the South, the character of anti-caste movement can be understood in the background of the Dravidian identity of the South, anti-Brahminism and the non-Aryan original inhabitants theory. So, as we have seen in our last lecture also, where we found that some of the radical Dalit movements which started in the 1920 in the South had somewhat a Dravidian connection, and they also incorporated the broader version of the Aryan invasion of the original inhabitants of the country, who were basically later on labeled as Shudras or the downtrodden. So, we have to understand the anti-caste movement in the South in terms of the broader notion of Dravidian nationalism which had started in those areas, and also anti-Brahminism and non-Aryan original inhabitants theory. They actually form the backdrop or background of the anti-caste movement in the South. Now, one of the important activists and theorist was Pandit Ayodhya, a Dalit who led the first anti-caste movement in Tamil Nadu. He interpreted, just like Phule, that the ancient India was inhabited by Dalits who were basically casteless and comprised a prosperous and peaceful society. So, you can find that there is a continuity of thought or continuity of this criticism of the Brahminical theory of the Aryan invasion, and they have reinterpreted this theory to say that actually the golden period, it predated the coming of Aryans, or it existed before the concurrence of the Aryans in India. And they argued that this was a golden period because it was a peaceful period where the most important feature of this society was that it was casteless in nature and the people were very prosperous. So, he wanted to argue in the similar line, as we have found in the case of scholars like Jyotirao Phule, that it was the advent of the Aryan and their invasion which led to the establishment of caste system in the society. And another important point which is slightly different from his earlier predecessors was that he considered the golden period of pre-Aryan invasion to be the Buddhist period. He considered the golden period as a Buddhist period, and he founded the Sakya Buddhist Society or South Indian Buddhist League based mainly on Dalits. So, he wanted to organize and unite the Dalits in the South across or on the lines of the principles of Buddhism. So, that was another important or distinctive feature of Ayodhya. Then another very important thinker, scholar and activist and leader was E.V.R. Ramaswamy, or most commonly revered as Periyar. He was from Erode. he started a new militant mass oriented movement against caste. And he, along with Gandhi, they participated in the Vaikom temple satyagraha, but eventually he developed some differences with Mahatma Gandhi and he got separated from it. He also opposed the Brahmanical basis of Hindu religion and called for abolition of both. So, he not only opposed the Brahmanical tradition, but he also opposed the Hindu religion, and therefore he called for abolition of both the system which were the basis of the caste hierarchy. He formed Self-Respect League in the year 1926. Now, this organization is very important because it worked for the abolition of caste, it worked for the upliftment of women, and it questioned all religions. So, he was an atheist and he tried to question the hold of all the types of religion over the people's life, and hence he objected to that. Another very important organization was the Dalit Panthers. Now, it was a militant organization of Dalit youth founded in Bombay, which is now Mumbai, in the year 1972. It was founded against the backdrop of increasing urban and the rural tension, especially the rising atrocities against the Dalits. And we must understand that these youths were inspired by Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar's ideas and his struggles. Now, some of the group's initial leaders were Namdeo Dhasal, J.V. Pawar, Raja Dhale and Arjun Dangle. Now, these were some of the group's initial leaders. Now, the group's name, that is the name of Dalit Panthers, it suggested black power and the blackness, and also it highlighted that the Dalit resistance is not limited by complacency of self-proclaimed a democratic nation state. So, we have to understand why the name of Dalit Panther was chosen, because it denoted black power, it denoted resistance, it denoted especially the objective of the Dalits to not to be or to not get complacent with the achievement of democracy or with the achievement of independence, but they have to go beyond that and they have to fight against various types of social injustices which are prevalent even in a democratic nation state. Now, one of the important achievement of the Dalit Panther was that they popularized the term Dalit, which was now expanded to include a wide range of groups. Now, they consisted of the members of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe who were already earlier included. Then it also included new Buddhist, working people and the landless, the poor peasants, women, and all those who are being exploited politically, economically and in the name of religion. So, you can see that the word Dalit was expanded and it included almost every section of the society who were excluded, who were exploited and who were marginalized irrespective of to which religion they belong. Another very important feature of them was they integrated Marxist capitalist exploitation with Buddhism. They were Marxist in nature, and during this period we have seen the outgrowth of various Naxalite movements across India. Various Naxalite groups were working across India to protest against the injustices which were perpetuated by the landlords or by the feudal system at the rural India. So, and they combined it with the Buddhist principle, because if you remember the basic tenets of Buddhism, it protested against or it questioned all forms of caste hierarchy. It denounced all forms of caste hierarchy and caste system. It talked about equality of human beings. It talked about the benefit and well-being of all people in the society. It did not make any discrimination, and it challenged some of the important tenets of Hindu religion, especially the institution of priesthood, then overemphasis on ritualism, practice of untouchability, discriminations, and so on. So basically they believed in the potentiality and capacity of each individual to develop and build up their personality as per their own choices and merits. So therefore, it was a very interesting combination, because on the one hand they were analyzing the exploitation through the means of Marxism or Marxist approach, and on the other hand they were trying to emancipate or find solutions to these problems through the Buddhist principle. And they identified the enemies of Dalits as landlords, then capitalists, then money lenders, and government controlled by the ruling caste. So you can see that after independence, and the new set of cadres have developed in the form of government employees or government officials who are ruled by the people belonging to upper caste. So they were also considered as enemy by the Dalit Panthers. Besides that, the landlords and then the capitalists and money lenders, who were very exploitative in their dealings with the poor and innocent villagers at the rural level, where they used to lend money at very high rate of interest to the poor and innocent villagers. So this exploitative relationship or helplessness was identified and analyzed by the Dalit Panther. Now another very important name, whose name he is a scholar and he belonged to low caste herding community in Andhra Pradesh, and his name is Kancha Ilayya. In his book Why I Am Not a Hindu, he proclaimed that the Dalits and ex-Shudras communities had different cultures and traditions and different ways of life and different production system which are different from the upper caste. He said that no such a society which can be said to be a homogeneous Hindu society, of which the scheduled caste or the downtrodden are an integral part. They have been never a part of Hindu society because they have not shared any of the traditions and customs of the Hindu society. And he has given a detailed picture and description of what are the different practices, cultures, ways of life, ways of eating, dining, then marriage laws of the Shudras and the Dalits, which were so different from the dominant traditions and customs of the upper caste in the Hindu society. Now, if we do not mention another very important name in the contemporary times, who was a very important political leader and helped in the foundation of the Bahujan Samaj Party, and his name, as we all know, was Kansi Ram. He was born on March 15, 1934 and belonged to a Sikh agriculturist low caste community. And he had played a very important role in mobilizing not only Dalits but also other marginalized and low caste members of the society under the banner of the political party, which is Bahujan Samaj Party. He wrote a book titled The Chamcha Age, or An Era of the Stooge, which was dedicated to Mahatma Jyotirao Phule, which later formed the founding ground for the establishment of the Bahujan Samaj Party. He also coined the term Manuvad, which explained how Manu's code led to the oppression and exploitation of the lower caste by chalking out punishments for those who dared to cross the limits. So this is very important because this word, it also highlighted in the similar vein the exploitation which have been taking place in the name of religion, in the name of Manusmriti, or in the name of the sanctity of various religious scriptures in India. And he has also mentioned that why Manu's code is important to understand, because it has prescribed various penal prescriptions for those who violated or who crossed the limits of caste system, especially the people who belong to the lower caste. Now, after understanding various thinkers and scholars' views on the critique of theory and practice of caste, now we come to another very important dimension of the Dalit narrative, is the critique of modernity. Now, we have understood the meaning of modernity in some of the other lectures of this course, in which I have explained that modernity is associated with the Enlightenment tradition, which emphasized the need for reason and rationality in all our endeavors of life. It talked about individual rights, autonomy and freedom, and it provided an important discourse on the need for rights, equality, justice, freedom, autonomy, etc. It talked about the need for a minimal state which will interfere very less or to the minimum extent in the lives of individual human beings. At the same time, we have already studied that modernism also talked about, or it is based on certain universalism, like the notion of abstract individual. It is based on a notion of abstract individual which gives primacy to reason or rationality, and therefore they have argued that irrespective of any nation, creed, caste, gender an individual belongs to, he will be considered as equal. So, it is an universal description or universal analysis of the nature of man. Similarly, there are many other universalism, or the liberal theory, for example, is also a meta theory which assumes certain generalization and general principles which can be applied across the world. Now, the Dalit criticism of modernity include raising questions about the universalisms that have characterized the emancipatory discourses of modernity. For example, if you take the case of rights, we find that the modern notion of rights is guided by the Western discourse, which is based on the notion of individual interest and individual rights. It is centered on individual and individual's interest. But when we talk of rights only in the individual context, forgetting that individual is also a part of the wider society or community of which he is an integral part, then we have to reinterpret the meaning of rights and meaning of individual. Because giving importance to abstract and individualistic right may lead to rise of self-assertion, or that rights which are based only on self-centered individual, it leads to neglect of the social and the community goals which are also essential for not only maintaining the lives of the individual, but also for maintaining the society and the state. So, therefore, those who are the proponents of the non-Western perspective of rights, they have argued that we have to understand the notion of rights or the notion of human rights from the community perspective also, from the cultural perspective also, of which the human beings are parts. Because being part of a particular community decides the identity of a man or a woman, and the numerous exploitation and violations of rights which takes place because of our being situated in a particular social, economic and political context. So, it is very important that we understand the social context, the cultural context, the political context, the economic context, and the cultural context in which the individual is functioning. So, therefore, the non-Western critiques of human rights, they have argued for making a reinterpretation of human rights discourse which is based on the Western precepts, and in the name of universalism they are applying it on each and every country, because we know that the non-Western countries are very much community based, they are communitarian in nature, and here the imposition of individualistic nature of rights can lead to various social problems. So, therefore, the Dalit scholars or the Dalit politics, they have also raised some of the questions regarding the universalism which has characterized the emancipatory discourses of modernity. And basically it has focused on two modern concepts. One is the nation, second is the secularism. Why secularism is important? Because secularism talks about making the state distant from the religion or adopting a policy of distance from the religion. When the state is making a distance from the religion, then it is also distancing from the foundational or the structural reasons behind the existence of caste in Indian society. So, therefore, it is very important to understand that this notion of secularism may not be congenial to the objectives and to the goals for which the Dalits or the activities which are directed to for their well-being. And second is the notion of nation, whether nation is a homogeneous entity or is a heterogeneous entity. Now, this has been a question of debate, because when we assume nation to be a homogeneous entity, then it assumes that all individuals are having a similar characteristic, having certain similar attributes. But the Dalit perspective, they argue that Indian nation do not constitute a homogeneous entity, because in this country there are certain groups and individuals who have been placed or who have been situated at the periphery of the nation. They have not been allowed to participate on equal terms along with other caste members in the process of nation building. Then how can we say that the Western notion of nation can be applicable to a country like India, which is having so much of diversities and differences and hierarchical structures in terms of caste? Then they have opposed also to the various binaries being set by the modernity, which in the contemporary politics or in the independence movement can be understood in terms of the binary of nationalism, then colonialism, and then secularism and communalism. So, basically the problem is that when we are talking in terms of these binaries, we are making two extreme positions, forgetting that there are other issues and problems which are not covered under these headings. When we are talking about nationalism, we are talking about in terms of the interest of the nation. And when we are talking in terms of interest of the nation, then it assumes that all the members of the nation will unite, will form a collective entity and work for the interest of the nation, or it signifies a certain sense of devotion towards nation shown through the level of patriotism and love for their country. But the point is that if some members or community or certain caste based groups, they are not allowed to participate in the common lives of the society, then how can they think of actually participating in the process of nation building, or how can they think of that they can agree to this Western notion of nationalism? Similarly, when we are talking in terms of colonialism, our priority is to fight against the colonial rulers and to achieve independence. And it is believed that when we are talking in terms of the colonialism or the colonies or the colonial rulers, then our first priority is political independence and not social reforms. Therefore, the agenda of making social reforms gets a secondary importance and it is somewhere lost. So, therefore, they have opposed to the binaries being set by modernity in contemporary politics and even during the independence movement. Dalit politics, it critiques both the binaries and it considers it to represent the third strand. So, they argue that this modernity's tendency to create binaries, they in a way overlook or they do not bother to look at other perspectives which are also existence in a particular time of the society. And therefore, they argue that they represent the third strand or an alternative perspective to the two dominant binaries which are visible, whether it is a reformist or it is a communal or whether it is the imperialism and the nationalism. Now, Kancha Ilayya have distinguished between three schools of thoughts in the anti-colonial struggle. So, basically when we read the history of our Indian freedom struggle, we study some of the dominant versions which constitute the mainstream discourse for understanding the Indian national movement. But Kancha Ilayya argues that there is a third perspective also which constitute a different variety of nationalism. So, by arguing that there are three types of nationalism, he is in fact challenging the dominant mainstream understanding that Indian nationalism is only of one variety. By pointing towards the three important strands of nationalism, he is trying to make us understand that we have to distinguish between the various shades of thoughts and opinions which were in prevalence during the Indian national movement. And the first was the Dalit Bahujan nationalism, which was represented by Jyotirao Phule, B.R. Ambedkar and Periyar. So, this was also a version of nationalism represented by a particular school of thought, where they wanted to bring about independence and social development of India from a certain perspective. Though it was not in the mainstream, but it was also a very important part of our Indian national history or discourse. Then the Hindu nationalism, which was represented by Tilak, Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, Golwalkar, S.P. Mukherjee and others. So, basically you find that a large number of names have been included by Kancha Ilayya, which range from a spectrum of scholars who advocate a complete Hindu based nationalism to use of certain symbols or use of certain tokenism of Hindu religion as part of the Indian national movement. Then the Brahminical communist nationalism. Now, it is very interesting that he is using the word Brahminical before the communist nationalism. So, there was a segment of communist leaders and supporters who had their own understanding of Indian nation and nationalism, and it was represented by some of the communist leaders of that time, P.C. Joshi, S.A. Dang, M.N. Roy, R.P. Dutt, etc. And they were, in spite of being leftist, they did not condemn the Brahminical tradition. They in fact, some of them belonged to the upper caste of the society, and therefore Kancha Ilayya termed them as Brahminical communist nationalism. Now, Dalit have critiqued the abstract citizen universal man or the equally abstract working class. So, they have criticized both the liberal notion of the abstract individual and the Marxist notion of the working class, because they believe that this abstract notion of citizenship does not take into account how an individual faces various types of discrimination on account of caste, then religion and any other identities. So, therefore, they argue that we need a different type of citizenship which is different from the Marxist and the liberal perspective. Then another objection is raised about the modernist notion of object-subject dichotomy. Now, it is assumed in the modernist tradition that the knower or the knowing subject will be neutral and objective and will stand above the object which he or she is observing. And in that position, neutral and in a distant position, he or she will derive knowledge or produce knowledge about the object. Now, this separation of object and subject in the modernist tradition has been rejected by the Dalit narrative, because they argue that the objective of the study is to understand the lives of Dalits, to create knowledge, authentic knowledge about the lives of Dalits and the oppressive practices which they are facing every day in their lives. And this authentic knowledge can be built only when the dichotomy between the subject and the object is removed. By having a distant understanding of the conditions of Dalits or the oppressive caste structure, it will not produce an authentic knowledge. Then they refuse to be assimilated in the voice of the dominant narratives marked by two components of modernity. One is the notion of nation and second is the notion of secularism. So, they have refused, they have been very alert about their being assimilated in the dominant narratives. So, they did not want to do that, they did not want to be assimilated. But at the same time, we have to recognize that all the elements of modernity, all the aspects of modernity have not been criticized or not have been a type of disadvantage to the Dalits or the downtrodden section of the society, because the ideas of modernity in the language of rights or through the medium of Western education and also the secularization of public sphere have provided important ingredients for the emancipatory struggle of the non-Brahmins and the Dalit movements. So, the role of Western ideas or the modern ideas have played a very important role in raising the awareness, in raising the consciousness amongst the Dalits about their rights, and it has helped in numerous ways in fighting for their rights, and it has also guided and motivated their various struggles against the caste system. So, with this I come to the end of my lecture, followed by certain questions which are based on the topics which are covered in today's lecture. Mention some of the anti-caste leaders from the south and their contribution, how Dalit has been defined by the group that is Dalit Panthers, what is the role of Kanshi Ram in Indian politics, explain some of the important Dalit critiques of modernity. So, with that I come to the end of this lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.